Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Tech Motoring. On today's episode we're going to be discussing the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour. What's the difference between the two, what do they mean, and why is it important to know that being an electric vehicle owner? Hit that subscribe button, stay tuned, we're going to dive in. Welcome back everybody. So like I was saying, we're going to be diving into the discussion of kilowatt versus kilowatt hour. What is the difference between the two? What do they mean? How come it's so commonplace for people to use them incorrectly? And we're going to discuss what the differences are between the two and how to use those in the proper context. So what we're going to do today is discuss kilowatt, what that means, kilowatt hour, what that means, and how the two actually interconnect with each other when it comes to electric vehicles, and why it's so important to get the phrases correct when it comes to describing your electric vehicle. And so we're not going to dive into voltage and amperage and what that means when it comes to kilowatt hour. We're not going to dive into all the very specifics of that. We'll scrape on it a little bit today, but we're not going to dive too much into electrical stuff today. We're going to just primarily discuss a kilowatt versus kilowatt hours. So what we have here is just a 12-volt battery. Now this is not to be used in any specific context. This is just a representation of, let's say, an electric vehicle battery. And so what we're going to be discussing today is an electric vehicle that has a battery size of about 100 kilowatt hours. We're just going to say 100 kilowatt hours of usable energy, just to make this easier. In case you're wondering, usable energy versus size of batteries, well, manufacturers typically build in what they call a buffer. And what that buffer does is it helps protect the battery in the extreme situation. So for instance, if you were to fully charge your battery or fully discharge your battery, you do have a small buffer in there to protect the cells from either bottoming out or being fully full of electricity. And so this little buffer is actually built into that to stop any severe damage to the battery from doing those full or deep discharges. So we have a little bit of a buffer in a battery. So if we were to have a vehicle with a 100 kilowatt hour usable battery, you're probably looking at anywhere between 103 to like 109 kilowatt hours of full battery capacity. But once again, the manufacturer doesn't usually give that to you because it's utilized as a buffer for safety inside of the battery, just to not stress the battery. So our example today is this is going to be a 100 kilowatt hour battery right here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to need to charge this battery up, not really, but theoretically, charge this battery up using an assortment of chargers, like this one right here, for instance. So this is a perfect example. This is a Tesla, well in this case, this is a Tesla wall connector, or mobile connector, excuse me, that we will be using as our demonstrating connector today, our demonstrating charger, if you will, or EVSE. And so we're going to be using this today to describe how something like this charges something like this, and the proper terminology to use when describing this occurrence. And so let's dive into the basics of what the difference is between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour. So you maybe heard me reference before that this was a 100 kilowatt hour battery. Once again, not actual scale, but we're just going to use that as a reference. 100 kilowatt hour battery. Now, I use the term kilowatt hour. And what a kilowatt hour is a measurement of capacity, or a measurement of size. It's what it can hold. So for instance, a 1 gallon jug can hold 1 gallon of liquid, basically. So it can hold 1 gallon of water. So 1 kilowatt hour can hold 1 kilowatt hour of energy. Now, not necessarily that physical size is the same, because 1 kilowatt hour can be different based on the technology of the cells and the type of materials they use to build that cell. So let's just say, for instance, that this was 1 kilowatt hour today, right? Well, in 10 or 15 years, this battery may be half the size, but still contain 1 kilowatt hour of energy. So that's kind of the difference between when you see the references between a kilowatt hour is similar to a gallon of gasoline. A gallon of gasoline will never change its physical size based on technology, but 1 kilowatt hour of battery can absolutely change its size, its shape, its weight. Anything can change when it comes to batteries based on the limitation of technology. Now, you may have also heard something about solid state batteries. We're not going to get into solid state batteries because honestly, I don't know that much about them. But we've heard about solid state batteries for many, many decades now. And I'm really hoping that we're knocking on the door of seeing solid state technology in the real world very soon. Of course, price parity will be its most difficult thing. So let's move this back over here and call this our 100 kilowatt hour car. So let's get back to talking about this being a vehicle. So let's just say that this is a battery pack that's in this Cybertruck, right? So you have a Cybertruck with a 100 kilowatt hour battery. The real Cybertruck is a little bit bigger. I know we don't have to reference that, but let's just say that this is the battery that's currently in the Cybertruck. It's 100 kilowatt hours. Well, now we need to charge this battery. So 100 kilowatt hours is its capacity of how much it could store. So there's a lot of battery modules and cells that come together that make up that 100 kilowatt hours of capacity. So once we have a capacity, now we need to charge that battery utilizing some sort of charging system. So here we're going to use this as a reference. So let's say we pull our Cybertruck into a garage and we say we want to plug it into our home charger, right? Well, our home charger will have let's say a rating of 11 kilowatts, which if you have a Tesla wall connector, you're maxing out that charger at 48 amps. And you'll get about 11 kilowatts. Your kilowatt rating is based off of how much volts and how many amps you can bring to that charger in order to get your kilowatt rating. So if you have 240 volts and you have roughly 48 amps of capability to put through that cable, that means 240 volts at 48 amps, which is the rate, will be going through this cable to come out of this connector and into the vehicle. Now, if you do the proper equation, and I'll put the equation right here so you can look at it, that will give you what your kilowatt rating is. So based on your voltage, now that could vary based on where you are, if you are residential versus commercial, and your amperage, which is what you're capable of pushing out through the proper wiring and breaker size, can be anywhere between, let's say, 48 amps of charging all the way down to, let's say 16 amps of charging. Chargers go higher and lower depending on what you need. Like for instance, you can even charge over 120 volt chargers. All right, so let's talk about what a kilowatt means. So a kilowatt is the amount of energy that is being flowed through this cable based on voltage and amperage and how much is coming out. So just to clarify, once again, kilowatt hour is the amount of capacity that is being held in a battery, let's say, and kilowatt is the speed in which you are charging said battery. Once you understand what those mean and the differences between a kilowatt, which is the rate of speed in which the energy is flowing, and a kilowatt hour, which is the amount of energy being stored, once you understand the differences between those two, everything else becomes more like a light bulb turned on, and you kind of just understand the difference now. So let's get back to what we were referencing before, as this Cybertruck had a 100 kilowatt hour battery. Now let's say you pull up to a charger in public that charges at 100 kilowatts, right? So let's say you plug in your vehicle and you get 100 kilowatts of energy. Well, that means at 100 kilowatts, you would fill that 100 kilowatt hour battery in 1 hour. Kilowatt hour. So the rate of charge gives you the capacity based on time. So once again, 100 kilowatt in 1 hour would be 100 kilowatt hours of stored energy. So that is a pretty simple way of remembering how that works. Now, of course, we could jump into the whole, well, cars don't charge at 100 kilowatts from 0 to full. And that's 100% true because there are safety mechanisms in place to prevent you from charging a car at its, let's say, maximum speed at the very bottom of the pack and the very top of the pack, which is typically why we see the fastest charging speeds on the lower end of the pack, usually around 10%, all the way up to maybe like the 50 to 60% mark before we start seeing a taper in what we call the charging curve. And so that's when you're charging a vehicle and you might have this really quick spike up to maximum speed. It might sit at that maximum speed for a few moments, and then as it fills up the battery 40, 50, 60%, you'll start seeing it taper down on the higher side, 70, 80, 90, 100. And so you see that taper as a safety mechanism to not stress out your batteries. This is a very necessary feature in order to not prevent damage to your batteries, which is why we have that charging curve. And so when you pull up to a charger, keep that in mind that there will be some relatively interesting ways that the battery charges. Now, that's primarily when you come across DC fast charging, where you're trying to charge the battery at really, really high rates of speed. Like, for instance, you're on a road trip. If you're charging at home at a level 1, which is the 120 volt charger, or a level 2, which is your 240 volt charger, well, then you might start seeing a little bit more of a solid straight line across the top. Because cars can primarily accept the full capabilities of level 1 and level 2 chargers and the battery, and so you typically see a pretty straight line all the way across up until the very end, 98, 99, 100%, you start seeing it taper down as it tries to top balance the battery cells. And so with AC charging, you're not going to really see so much of that charging curve, and you will see a pretty consistent kilowatt rate across it. So for instance, if you plug into a level 2 charger, let's say you pull up to a hotel, a destination charger, you jump into your Tesla, whether it be a Cybertruck or whatever, and you'll see on the screen, you'll see a kilowatt rating, and that kilowatt is saying, hey, I'm charging at, let's just say 10 kilowatt of energy, because let's say it's a 48 amp charger, but let's say it's limited to 208 volts because it's commercial. So it's probably going to only charge around 10 kilowatt at that rate. And so if you have 10 kilowatts, that means it'll charge a 100 kilowatt hour battery in, you got it, 10 hours. So when you do the simple math, when you understand the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour, everything else kind of falls into place. So that is pretty much what I wanted to explain to you today. Now, there are some weird things out there in the market that you might see that are confusing. There are a lot of people that are still using kilowatt to reference how big a battery is, or kilowatt hour to reference how fast you charge, and it could get very confusing. And it really is our place or your place to understand the differences between speed versus capacity. And now there are other references using kilowatt that might confuse you. For instance, a lot of EVs nowadays are using the reference of kilowatt when referencing how much power a car has. In lieu of horsepower, which we're very much used to, which we've been using for 100 years in the car industry, instead of using horsepower, we are actually using the term kilowatt to provide a source of this is how much power this car can output. So you might see some cars that have a 200 kilowatt output. And once again, I'll put the formula right here so you could take a look at that. And that is another reference that you might come across in the wild, is seeing a kilowatt rating when referencing the amount of power that a car has. So not only do you have to think about kilowatt in the sense of how fast does it charge, but you can also think about kilowatt in the sense of how fast can a car accelerate, or how much power does it have. And so kilowatt can be used in that reference. Now, it's funny that over the past 4 years or so of being an enthusiast in the electric vehicle market, that I've come across these mistakes in even actual OEM documentation and products. It's crazy that I've even seen Monroney sheets, which you would know as the window sticker on a car when you're going to buy it. It has all the stuff that's in there, and it will say it has 250 kilowatts of free charging. And it's crazy to think that manufacturers, car manufacturers, are actually still mistaking this stuff. I see it all the time. I even see this mistake on my Electrify America app when I used to have one of their level 2 home stations in my garage, where it used to tell you how much kilowatt hour when it was trying to reference how many kilowatts. And so it's really weird to see these confusions happen even at the highest level of market. Actual OEMs, car manufacturers, they're still making this mistake, and we really need to get by this. So I hope this video helped you out. I hope you learned something, the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour, the difference between the two, how to calculate how fast you're charging and how fast it'll charge that battery. keeping in mind of your charging curve. And if this helped you out, hit the like button just below. If you have any more comments on this, or if you have anything that maybe I missed, throw it down in the comments as well. Of course, I'd like to thank you very much again for watching another episode here on Tech Motoring, and we'll see you on the next one. And remember, welcome to the future, and welcome to Tech Motoring. We'll see you soon.